Back in 1980, Parker Palmer, now a kind of famous, well-known author and spiritual writer, published his first book, a small little volume titled The Promise of Paradox, a celebration of contradictions in Christian life. And in this book, Palmer points out the apparent paradoxes at the heart of the Gospels, and therefore at the heart of Christian faith. How Jesus speaks of losing your life to gain life. Jesus speaks of abundance in the midst of scarcity. Jesus speaks of a poverty of spirit leading to God's copious grace. And Palmer argues, rather than seeing these apparent contradictions as hindrances to faith, he asserts that holding the tension between these apparent dualities leads to wisdom, to insight. How else can we see the cross, the ultimate symbol of death, become a symbol of new life? Niels Bohr, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, defined paradox this way. The opposite of a correct statement is a false statement, he says, but the opposite of a profound truth may be another profound truth. Now, one of the paradoxes essential to our faith tradition is the tension between the claims that we make that Jesus was fully human and Jesus was fully divine. That duality lies at the heart of what we claim about Jesus, and it is this inherent tension, this inherent contradiction, this seemingly impossible assertion that captures the paradox at the heart of our faith. Palmer asserts that this is not a hindrance to hold such claims in tension, but actually gets at a truth more profoundly when we hold these contradictory truths together, allowing them to open our minds and hearts to new ways of seeing and new ways of being. Now, the paradox between Jesus as fully human and Jesus as fully divine is hard to hold together. It's my experience in our lives that we usually end up far more comfortable with one of those poles than the other. Some of us are probably far more comfortable thinking of Jesus as fully divine, all powerful, all knowing. For others, Jesus is more understandable as this deeply human with all the vulnerabilities, with all the short-sightedness inherent in that claim. Now, usually, for most of us, we end up on one side of that paradox, depending on where we are, maybe in our lives, and what we might need from God at the time. Unless we think that's just simply a little intellectual exercise or an exercise of faith, the ramifications of one's belief in the divinity and or the humanity of Jesus becomes very important to many of us. Years ago, y'all may remember the movie Last Temptation of Christ. Who's ever read the book or seen the movie? It came out, and it was based on a book written a long time ago that wrestled with the humanity and wrestled with the divinity of Jesus. And down south in Texas, where I grew up, the response to the movie was quite emotional, people taking exception to its portrayal of Jesus as very human. People were so incensed, I don't know if any of you have heard of this, that it led to protests at movie theaters. Security guards being posted in the movie theater because people were slashing the screens. The flashpoint in the movie, what many really rejected and were upset about, was the portrayal of Jesus having relations with his wife, Mary. And that was far too human for many believers in the Bible Belt. Now, the funny thing is that the question at the heart of, the real question at the heart, the real theme at the heart of that book and the movie was that the last temptation of Christ was simply to come down off the cross and just be human with a family and children, rather than bear the burden of divinity upon the cross. The point was, he chose in the book and in the movie a paradoxical way to be human and divine on the cross. But people were too upset to see that. Of the many stories of Jesus in the Gospels, I would say the one we read this morning is one of the more human and, I'll be honest, contradictory to reconcile and understand. Jesus appears so human, maybe, I'll be honest, too human for my comfort level. Sat in a geographical region from his home in Galilee, far from home, in a land inhabited by non-Jews, Jesus is confronted by a Canaanite woman who simply cries out to him, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is possessed. My daughter is tormented by a demon." Powerful appeal to Jesus. And yet, what is Jesus' response? It's less than compassionate, almost, I would say, contradictory to what we would expect Jesus, the stories we know about him. He ignores her. He didn't even deign to answer her. The disciples, bothered by her crying out, her shouting, says, "Jesus, send her away, for she keeps shouting at us." I think it's very human to tell those who protest to just be quiet. You're too loud, right? Just then, Jesus says the word I find really offensive. Right? Words that just doesn't jive with what I know about him in the other parts of the gospel. I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. And of course, he means by that the Jews. And I try to make sense of that rather cold response to this Canaanite woman. Maybe I try to think maybe he was just tired or overwhelmed by all the pain and suffering he was trying to meet. Maybe he just had enough of it all. All the need around him, all the people crying out for something. Maybe he's just trying to draw some boundaries, some lines, so that he doesn't lose himself. Maybe he's just human after all. But he doubled down here when she comes to him and she kneels before him. She prostrates herself before him. And she said, "Lord, help me. Lord, help me." And I try to imagine that woman whose daughter is tormented by a demon. Mother hurting for her child. A child who might be, I try to imagine, wrestling with mental illness or some unexplained physical ailment that torments her. Just doesn't hurt, it torments her. And she is desperate, so desperate that she goes begging for help from her ancient enemy, the Jewish rabbi. And she says, I think that most human of words we say a lot, "Lord, help me." And then out of Jesus' mouth come the words I would never expect to hear. "It's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." Did Jesus just call this desperate woman a dog? So contradictory to how other stories in the Gospels that we've read and heard about, how Jesus in his ministry and mission is overwhelming compassion for all of God's children. There is a part of me, I must be honest, that wants to cut this out of the Bible, right? Maybe I try to think to myself, maybe it's just play acting to make a theological point, which is not unacceptable. That Jesus, but it's a story that couldn't be that Jesus could be not so human that he would actually have prejudice, right? Or bias towards another human being. That's too radical an idea. At this point, if there was a movie screening of this story, I think I'd be slashing the screen, right? And then the woman says, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eats the crumbs that fall from the master's table." She's quick. Wow. It's unavoidable to realize that really the true hero of this story, as it's told, is not Jesus. It's this unnamed, desperate Canaanite woman. And here she stands before the Lord of the universe and challenges and turns his words upside down and has the courage, the gumption to advocate for her child. She is a model for us all. And then something happens. It's rather dramatic. It seems to come out of the blue. "Woman," Jesus says, "great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And we are told her daughter is healed from that moment on. So I wonder, what happened here? Was Jesus just play acting to illustrate a point of how God's grace comes to all of God's children? That's certainly a possible interpretation. That he did that to teach the disciples then and to teach the disciples here today how we should embrace even those we might consider enemies or foreign. That certainly would be a fair interpretation that could make us, I'll be honest, I'm more comfortable with that. But I wonder if another way to reflect on this story is to see it as an illustration of the humanity of Jesus. And to say Jesus is fully human means Jesus can change his mind. To be human, let's be honest, to be human is to have prejudices and biases towards others, especially those who are not part of our community. To be human is also to have the capacity to listen and to learn and to change our minds. To claim Jesus is fully human, then, is to say Jesus has this capacity to change his mind. He embodies that human capacity and shows us that this is a way forward. Now, the hero for me in this story is that courageous woman who stands and advocates for her daughter and speaks out and stands up there and says, "Help my child tormented by a demon." She is brave and courageous. She has a voice. And Jesus says, "Woman, you have great faith." And let's remember that for those who are protesting on our streets or protesting in the corridors of the Capitol, that there is great courage to do that. But let us also remember that Jesus models for us a capacity to change our minds. Now, we may not think that's possible. I mean, we kind of get set in our ways. I'm getting old. I'm kind of got some ideas about how the world should work. But what if this story models for me and Jesus models for me this capacity to change my mind? To maybe realize and reflect on my own biases and prejudices. I will share that in many conversations over my life, I have had my mind changed. When I talk to my brothers, African American brothers and sisters, and hear their stories, their experiences, and what I had assumed I thought I knew, I did not know, and I learned something. That part of discipleship is not being set in a certain set of beliefs, but to be open to the Spirit, to be open to the voice of those often pushed aside, that our minds might be changed. Now that's scarier than I'd like to admit. But I think Jesus models for us the truth that we should change our minds. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.